Hello, everyone. Welcome to Grand Rounds. I never know exactly how promptly to start meetings like this, but I know that we're recording and we might as well make a start. Tom Barden, who normally organises Grand Rounds, is away this week, but it is the medical education takeover anyway. And I have taken this opportunity to steal the floor this week to do my own favorite topic. I have been really fortunate that I've been given an opportunity to do a talk on a related topic in several places coming up over the next few months. And so I thought I would practice my best lines on the Grand Rounds audience before letting myself loose on an unsuspecting public. So the topic today is the future of medical education. For those of you who don't already know me, as if that was a thing, I'm Ellie Hothersall Davis. I am head of undergraduate medicine here at the University of Dundee, and I'm one of the public health consultants. And I have had a role in the medical school for just coming up to 15 years now. So this is really an opportunity to share some thoughts and ideas that have been playing on my mind over the last little while. I am not as used to Teams as to Zoom rather as I am with Teams, and so I'm really hoping that we don't have some form of technological disaster here, which is starting with the screen showing on the wrong display. So bear with while we get that sorted. Display settings, that's the one. Swap. Beautiful, right. It is such a frustration that no two systems work the same to me. How does that look? It looks to me like that's going to work.
Yes, that's it, Ellie.
Thank you, Kirsty and Chris. So now that I've got it on, I can see the slides mode. That means I won't be able to see hands and chat and so on until the end, but my plan is to kind of rattle through and hopefully leave enough time for lots of questions and discussion at the end. The purpose of this is to be to provide food for thought rather than necessarily tell you a bunch of stuff you didn't already know. So here's my outline. Tell them what you're going to tell them. I'm going to try and share a vision of the future with you that isn't just a dystopian hellscape, because I think we get enough of them already. It's not possible to talk about medical education in the future without talking about healthcare in the future. And so actually, it's almost a 50-50 split about where we think healthcare might be going, and then moving into education more generally. And then assuming that we're not all overtaken by AI and reduced to some sort of dystopian hellscape, what might we need in the future? And a bit of a reflection on what it's like to be educating through such uncertain times and how we can do our best in difficult circumstances. And so I thought I would just start with a reflection on the fact that there is enough dystopia, there is enough threat of Armageddon out there at the moment. And it is possible, I am quite sure, to spend a full hour reflecting on how awful everything is and how close to the edge many of us might feel like we are living right now. But I don't want to take your time up with that. You're giving your time to listen to me, and so I'm hoping that you would like to hear a little bit about a better vision. So here are my principles for that better vision. And I put a fluffy rainbow on the side of this as a sort of acknowledgement that this is definitely at the unrealistic or at least idealistic end of the spectrum. But I am imagining we could create a world where we are thinking about offering utopian world for people where we are really trying to provide the very best for the largest possible number of people, where we're thinking about the needs of the population and meeting them rather than thinking about where we can make the most money, who can do the most, get the most gain out of this, rather than bringing that market forces, that capitalist neoliberal view to things. I am very much being focused on how can we do the best we can for the most people. I believe if we do that, we can create somewhere where we actually want to work, where we want to keep doing the jobs that we do or jobs like what we do. But as I'm going to kind of talk through where healthcare is going, I think one of the things that we need to be fundamentally contributing to is conversations about where doctoring is going. And I don't think that's a comfortable space. I think there's a lot of change that may well come in that area in the relatively near future, which doesn't necessarily align with what we do right now, and certainly doesn't align with what people my age thought medicine was when we applied for medical school in the first place. And so it is definitely not all comfortable, but that is surely what the purpose of having conversations like this is for. So if we imagine that we are looking at healthcare in the future, I would argue that we need to shift the focus. And I know you will have heard this before. I'm not coming up with anything wildly new here, but if we are going to have a healthcare system which is able to meet the needs of the population, one of the key requirements there is for it to be in any way affordable. We need to spend more time, energy, and resource on prevention and harm reduction and less time, energy, and resource on cleaning up the mess after it's already been made. And so that shift in healthcare, it's talked about quite regularly by politicians. It comes out in all sorts of planning documents, but without the concrete changes, without shifts in funding to accompany that, we are never really going to see that happen. But at the same time, it's reasonable for us to assume that over the next decades, we're going to see dramatic changes in how we provide treatment for all sorts of conditions. And the thing about new inventions is we don't know what they're going to be until they happen. But for example, we know personalized medicine is going to shift things. We know that computer modeling of drug molecules means that we are able to potentially come up with new solutions in chemicals for treating people that were not previously thought of. As those come in, we are likely to see really quite dramatic shifts in what gets treated, survival rates for different diseases, and so on. A future healthcare system, I think, to be logical, to be functional in the future, is going to need to focus on the consumer. And I don't mean consumer as in person with money here. I mean the people who receive the healthcare. We're going to look at that as we go through. And I know consumer is a word that many of us have antibodies to, but I mean it here because I'm trying to get away from the idea of a patient, because we should be making use of taking advantage of our healthcare system from before a time when we are unwell. I think there will be a lot of personalization to see, and I'm going to kind of explore that in just a moment. But what works for me is very different from what works for my mother, and probably very different from what works for my daughter. The generations have got very different needs and very different expectations of healthcare, and we are trying to navigate through that. And currently providing this one size fits all, everybody gets the same approach, which clearly is not going to be functional if we have to be more adaptable and have more routes into therapies, more potential outcomes, and so on in the future. The other aspect, which I think is quite related to the receiver of healthcare rather than the giver of healthcare, is about where those treatments take place. And there's been a lot of talk. The political narrative in Scotland is about care closer to home. But if that happens in a way which reduces the standard of care received, then that is not useful to anybody. I put this disclaimer here. There are some very interesting and, dare I say, inspiring people out there who are talking about the future of medicine, in a way which is very shiny, very technological. And there is a website called Medical Futurist. The guy on there, his talks are great. I'm not trying to do anyone down, but every time I listen to somebody who's called themselves a medical futurist, and I don't know why you would, I feel like I'm getting a sales pitch. And nothing that I want to talk about today is intended to be doing anything other than sharing what I've been thinking about with this and where we're trying to move our philosophy towards, and trying perhaps to share a bit of um, understanding that I'm going to argue, I think, that we are in an era of technological and healthcare development that mean that the foundations on which we are standing are no longer as stable as they used to be. So I'm simply trying to share my thinking as we try to navigate through this. I have nothing to sell. The background to some of this, much of this you collectively will already know, but one of the things that we are mindful of is that our population, the planetary population, is rising still, and is probably rising at a faster rate right now than ever before in the whole of human history. And the impact that has on at a national and a global level is part of what makes the future so difficult to really envisage. I thought it was interesting that post-COVID, the overall UN population projections actually are lower than they were a decade ago, and so we're now predicted to peak sooner and peak at a slightly lower number. In some ways, I'm not sure if it really matters whether the peak human population is 10 billion or 10.5 billion. It's still an awful lot more people than we have right now. It's a much larger drain on the planet's resources than we have right now. And the impact that that's going to have is very dramatic. At the same time, the WHO estimate that the healthcare provision, which is already completely inadequate in parts of the world, will be made worse by this growing population. And as you can see from the little green box I've added here, as early as 2030, we're looking at a deficit of 10 to 11 million, depending on which page of the WHO report you read. Um, so that's soon. That's like now. These are people who we should be training right now and are not in the system. And that deficit is projected to grow proportionately over time, meaning that the provision of healthcare internationally cannot match the models that we currently have in place, which again drives that shift. It means we have to provide something different in the future. Otherwise, what we end up with are a huge proportion of the population who are completely underserved by healthcare. This is not a remote problem. This is not something which we can't understand or get our heads around. I think this, as I was looking to try and find the exact figures on this, try and get my quotes as up to date as possible, I happened upon this, which is not as up to date as possible because I can see it's from 2019. But this story from Syria, where there are two psychiatrists for an entire population of 3 million people. And I was just thinking that that reflects such a different world from what we know, but at the same time, I don't think it's that hard for us to imagine how that looks. I mean, we think our waiting lists are bad. Presumably, there's no such thing as a waiting list in a world like this. But also that in a world like people are encountering in northwest Syria at the moment, the idea that we could just send all of these people to use a little well-being app instead doesn't feel like an appropriate solution. So I'm not for a moment suggesting I know the answer to the system level change that's needed to address problems like this, but it's got to play into the overall pattern. And as a species on this planet, our trajectory has to take this into account. You all know that the population is aging, but the speed at which populations are aging is very different in different parts of the world. And so I use this slide every year when I talk to our postgraduate students on the master's degree about public health and aging. But for example, so this figure shows how in Western Europe in particular, we saw a doubling in the population of those aged over 65 from about 7% to about 14%. And in France, that happened over the space of 100 years, 120 years, if I'm reading that graph right. Whereas we're seeing that same size doubling in other parts of the world. So you've got China, Thailand, and Brazil there, right over on the right-hand side, where that doubling in the size of the population has happened over the space of 5 to 10 years, which is a completely different setup. Like how you could possibly hope to design services that are going to respond to that pace of change, I do not know. And again, sort of glad that it's not actually me that has to. But the reason that I point this out is this lovely quote that I've used for years. We already are in the UK, despite how awful it can seem from time to time, we are actually living in many people's future utopia. It's just that that future is not evenly distributed within our own country. It's not evenly distributed, and globally, that is definitely the case. When we're worrying about older people, the reason this matters is because that is where so much of the money that we spend on our healthcare system sits. Well, I don't know about you, but when I was a medical student, I was kind of told that you've got this U-shaped graph for healthcare spending. You spend a lot on babies in the first year of life, and then you spend a lot on older people in the last year or two of life, and the bit in the middle is relatively cheap. The most recent data, so this is from the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, which you will know is the English budget. It's the English bean counting office, but it's reasonable to assume that the sort of numbers they're talking about is about the same. And what you can see here is that actually that spend as we get older just gets dramatically bigger, and the how that compares with what we spend on children's services is absolutely tiny. And hospital community health services take up a huge proportion of that proportion. And so if we're thinking about shifting services over time, that is obviously where some of the low-hanging fruit are going to be. That said, there's such a temptation so often for us to take responses, decisions, come up with new plans that are based on this sense of heightening anxiety that something has to be done, and therefore this thing in front of us is the thing that must be done. We know that that doesn't really work. We know that it needs a lot more considered thought. And we know that it needs a lot more stakeholder involvement and engagement before we really come up with solutions that are going to work for our population. However, to do all of that, we need to know what is available and what can be done. And that is part of the problem in the time that we are living through, that so many things are shifted, that the somethings which might have been sensible and logical even 10 years ago may not necessarily work now. And so what I was thinking was perhaps rather than trying to solve that problem today, because we are not all the right people for it, we could think about where we would like it to go. And by influencing and emphasizing that direction of travel, we can get to a point where we know where we want the decisions to point, and then we can influence those decisions differently. So, I didn't want this to be a big, heavy talk. I wanted it to be something that was helping to express some thoughts that I wanted to share. So I thought I would take us to some science fiction. I have selected a small handful of sci-fi greats here for your delectation, but I do invite you, if you're watching this and you've got access to the chat just now, feel free to add in any other sci-fi doctors that you feel I missed out and could have contributed usefully, because it's a large pool out there. So the history of Doctors in Sci-Fi is basically the history of the social norms of the time, and what was emphasized and what was considered important within the big sci-fi roles of any given era reflects a lot about what we thought was important in society at the time. So we're going to start with Bones from original Star Trek. Bones is essentially a space GP. In the odd episode, he does something a bit clever, but he's very much a generalist. He's very much part of the community, part of the family. Extremely grumpy, but apparently you were allowed to be grumpy back in those days, and really sort of helping to reinforce and reproduce the family values, the conservatism of the 1960s, but with that slight open-mindedness and a socialist outlook that was part of what made Star Trek different from many of the TV shows of the 1960s. So from Bones, I take you to Dr. Beverly Crusher, who is for people of my era, the next generation Star Trek is for people like me, the actual original Star Trek, because we watched it before the really retro old one. Beverly Crusher is possibly the single woman who has it all ever written into any piece of fiction anywhere. She literally fulfills almost every role that society could ever ask of anybody at various points in the series. She can captain the ship. She heals everybody. She has a successful family, albeit she is not married. She does all sorts of things. And again, this is kind of reflecting that ideal of woman who has it all from the 80s into the 90s. So next, I'm going to offer you Simon Tam, a little bit more niche, this one. This is from Firefly, a bit more recent. This is partly a hat tip to Tom if he ever gets around to watching this in playback, because Tom made me watch all of Firefly back in the day. He is he's an outstanding genius. The brain, the size of a planet, perhaps not necessarily particularly good at functioning socially, but when it comes to getting people through dreadful injuries in battles and so on, he's the one that you're relying on. And then lastly, if Firefly was niche, I suspect that offering you a Ripper doc from a computer game is even more niche. Cyberpunk 2077 has an entire cadre of professionals known as Ripper Docs. The name is absolutely intentional, but comes from the earliest iterations of the cyberpunk genre, which is a very dystopian, very prescient description of a world driven by technology and big corporations, where the economies are so interchangeable and interdependent. No decision happens anywhere without it being made by large mega corporations. the doctors themselves are entirely profit and tech driven, and within the context of the genre, you wouldn't go to this doctor with chest pain and an MI, presumably because in the world in which that operates, nobody lives long enough to have an MI. One of the things I was really struck by as I was thinking about this is we've had this shift from doctor as something that bears a very close resemblance to what we understand as doctors to something which is much more of an expert technician role, where you are providing battle triage, or you're replacing an eye with a digital eye. You're doing things. You've got a hands-on, very technical role that clearly requires a lot of knowledge and skill to get you there, but is not necessarily providing medical services in that family doctor kind of sense that we are used to. And I think that is, like I say, these are the examples I picked on, but I think that this is a pattern which you can see again and again. And maybe that reflects a shift in how we're thinking about medicine as it could be provided in the future. Maybe it's just reflecting the way we feel about the world in which we live. What about the rest of our lives? So, what does the rest of the internet teach us? So, I was thinking, as I have tried to interact with primary and secondary care recently and comparing that experience with the experience of buying a new car. So I am thinking about a new car. And so these days, rather than going to a large shop and speaking to somebody, I am likely to start with a Google search. If anyone's got any recommendations for electric cars, especially large ones, do please let me know. Uh, so, a bit of a Google search, bit of a troll through. Do I like the yellow one? Do I like the blue one? I don't do cars. I only like colors. I might go on to something like Reddit where I can see lots of people's thoughts on the same topic. I can search very quickly for focused information about the thing that I'm most interested in. I can narrow that down. I can refine my search so that I am finding information that's very pertinent to me. I can then, having chosen my car, I have not yet chosen my car, but I've used this as an example, just in case you were wondering, that I can go as far as buying this car online. I can click and I can get my credit check done and everything, all of which I am doing from the comfort of my sofa. I do not have to have at any point lifted my eyes from that little screen in front of me whilst the big screen is up there. How many people do I have to speak to in this in real time? Not one. And if you think about what it was like buying a car in the past, that is a hugely transformed experience. And I'm not saying that everybody has that experience. But I am saying that what has shifted is so dramatic that there is now a pathway that lets us get all the way from I need a new car to I own a new car without once having spoken to a human being. What do people like me who like to do all of that without having spoken to a human being? What do we do for healthcare now? Well, most of the time I will start with something which lets me have a screen that lets me type my stuff in so that I can do everything asynchronously. I am very busy and I do not want to have to make appointments for things. I don't want to have um to sit around. I don't want to sit around waiting for the phone to ring. I want to be able to send what I need somewhere and have what I need come back to me. I have drawn up, so the next slide I have drawn up, it is very much an imagining of what an interaction might look like in the future. I am not suggesting this system exists. This is not me doing my futurism bit. It's simply how I can see that communication in healthcare could change. So you can imagine, I can imagine, and therefore I'm assuming you can, a world whereby our patients type their symptoms into a search engine. So they're not at this point actually thinking they need a doctor. They're just wondering why it is that their eyes are streaming or why they're suddenly wheezy or something else. But it wouldn't be that difficult. Indeed, I would be astonished if it isn't already happening, that those searches are picked up and you are then diverted into a triage algorithm. And you could, for example, at that point, require some verification of identity so that you're not getting a lot of time wasting dross filling up the system. If through that system, through that process, it was identified that the person is experiencing an emergency, you could be doing alerts without any human actually having had to take a call. The whole thing, for some cases, could be happening in an automatic way, followed by an automatic alert to the nearest ED, an automatic transcript of the conversation of the whatever we call it. Is it conversation when it's all just online? I don't know. A copy of that could go into the GP records automatically. That whole thing could be streamlined in a way that didn't need anybody there. And yes, you might get cases where things were declared emergencies when they didn't need to be. But we are not far from a smart enough system that we can train it to be better at telling the difference between actual emergencies and not emergencies. You could also have a system added in there where the less urgent stuff was sent to GP with a recommendation for tests and management. It looks like they've got blah, 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 blah. What do you think? You could add in, perhaps this person might benefit from a referral to physiotherapy. Perhaps they might benefit from a referral to the local reading group for their socialization. All sorts of potential things could be added in there really very easily if a good system existed in the first place. If you had somebody who wasn't so urgent but did need seeing, you could this could feed in such that the next available appointment at your GP practice automatically gets allocated to you. So yes, that would be 3 o'clock on Thursday, but you hadn't had to do anything until the point at which you said, yeah, that'll be fine. Thank you. I will come then. And I've added this in another color because it's a sort of extra layer, but you can imagine that if all of this can happen at a very primary care, if you like, but pre any intervention of any sort, you could also, not without any great difficulty, imagining a world whereby you've got adaptive clerking paperwork. So once you've told the system that the patient in front of you has chest pain, it starts to give you the most important questions to ask first. It starts to give you the bits of history that you might not have remembered to ask about. It says everybody with chest pain, or most people with chest pain had the following tests ordered. You could have workflow management for reporting results. So the chest x-rays are gone. So therefore they're going to be reported through this system. And you could have personalizable treatment plans at the end of all of that. So this person had these symptoms, they're already on this medication, they had these blood tests, they had these treatment outcomes, etc. Their genetic profiling shows this. Here is the recommended adjustment to their treatment. Here's the antibiotic that will work best for this exacerbation. Those kind of things. All of that feels to me like we are not very far from these steps being able to be built into a system. Now, I'm not saying that the NHS is in a position to pay for this right now, but it does feel like this is the direction of travel for a lot of healthcare. And there's two things that I think are important from that. One is if we could do that so that the uncomplicated stuff is going through a straightforward set of algorithms, it is being in the main dealt with in a predictive way. This happens, therefore, this is going to happen next. Then one might hope that what that did was it freed up capacity within the system so that the humans who need to do the clever stuff have time and space to be able to do that clever stuff. However, the way we get good at the difficult things is by already knowing the not difficult things so well we could do it in our sleep. And so I do not know, and I'm going to argue it's one of the things we really need to spend time and energy thinking about in medical education. How do we get a system which lets you learn on the basics, on the easy, on the straightforward, so that you are ready for the difficult and the complex when there's not enough capacity within the system to do both? I've already said the future is already here. I'm saying it again. My colleagues in general practice tell me that, for example, there are quite a lot of practices around the place where Heidi is being used as part of the medical note taking. So this is as I understand it, predictive text and AI note generation, so that you can take your consultations and it will add to the notes for you. I found another one which um, claims to be being used both in the States and here. So so it did have just a big NHS logo on it until I clicked screen capture, at which point it had disappeared. But that does include North Central London Integrated Care System, amongst others. Again, as you can see, medical notes that write themselves. So these AI systems, these auto completion systems, are already in existence, are being marketed. As a side note, I thought it was worth just zooming in ever so slightly on the difference between those two screen captures because I thought it was interesting, and I'm stealing your time, so therefore you're obliged to hear what I tell you is interesting. I thought it was fascinating that one of these, Heidi, in the screen capture is offering you what's the evidence for REBOA or REBOA versus resuscitative thoracotomy, whilst the other is offering sore throat. I did feel like they're both aimed at primary care, but it did feel like one was marketing itself in a slightly different way from the other there. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. This is American data from actually from January this year, looking at uptake of predictive and machine learning models being used in hospitals across the US. So this is divided by what they call census division, and it is a masterclass in perhaps how not to present data. But what you can see, the dark blue is what percentage, the size of the dark blue box is the number, and the percentage written on it is the total percentage in that region of hospitals that are using machine learning models in their hospitals. And then the lighter blue is non-machine learning predictive models. So those don't adapt over time in the same way. They only adapt when the update is provided by the company. But you can see from this that across the US, almost every part of the US is using at least 40%, or at least 40% of hospitals are using machine learning as part of their clinical care. The laggards are in the West South Central area, where a mere 38.3% of hospitals have got machine learning involved in their clinical care. To my knowledge, this is a much lower percentage in the UK. But I did notice when I was last at a medical education conference, there was a lot of talk from partners in the US about how they were trying to teach medical students about things like clerkings in a world where that you do have that adaptive form. So you put the patient's chest pain at the top and the paperwork changes on you, which feels useful when you're a harried doctor trying to get 20 clerkings done that day, but might be quite challenging to teach medical students about, because we still want them to know what the questions are meant to be. We don't want them, unless perhaps I'm wrong on this, but my belief is that we still want our medical students to have an idea what the whole series of questions you should ask about chest pain is, and then only to adapt what they're doing once they are going down the funnel of diagnostic reasoning. But then the point here is that what is a doctor is changing. And so to return a little bit to that, what did sci-fi tell us doctors were going to be? Where are doctors in this new world where there's so much AI out there, where there's so many other ways that we can be accessing healthcare information, where we can just put our symptoms into Reddit and hope someone tells us what we've got. What is the role of the doctor and what do we want it to be in the future? Are we looking for genial pillars of the community, the Dr. Bones of this world? Do we really think that that's what we are going to continue to be in the next 50 years? Are we experts in communication? Do we manage complexity? This new phrase that comes from the Royal College, the Academy of Royal College's report that came out last week about doctors as risk holders, our unique skill as doctors could be is that we are able to make decisions, hold the uncertainty of that, the responsibility for that in ourselves. Is that the core unique selling point of doctors? And if so, how do we then defend that from other people? Are we just glorified technicians? Do we need to train doctors of the future to become people who do technical, difficult things and not worry too much about the fact that if you're the knee replacement doctor, that you can't do the other things? Or are we, to use Antonovsky's phrase about salutogenesis, are we the people who make health? Are we leading and innovating the healthcare system such that we are providing that leadership in the future? And again, if we're doing that, how do we defend that from all of the other people, specialties, entire portions of the political sphere who think that that's their job rather than ours? When we think about those skills, and you'll appreciate I haven't given you an answer because I don't really know, we need to think about what those skills are going to be. So currently we're in this position where we're trying to be all of those previous roles to all people. I'm not sure that's sustainable, but here's where we are. The General Medical Council currently define the skills we need for our new graduates to sit within these three big domains. So you will have seen this 100 times before. My apologies. But here we are with outcomes for graduates. And down at the bottom, we've got professional knowledge, what everyone needs to know as a doctor before they start work. In professional skills, you've got what you need to be able to do before you start work. So they are obviously a little bit different. And within that, there are some very technical things that you need to be able to do independently, taking blood, that kind of thing that fits in there. But then there's other things around communication skills and using information, being trusted with information that fit there. And then finally, there's what we call professional values and behavior. So these are the values, the responsibilities, the understanding of the obligations that you bear to society if you're going to be a doctor. That's what we currently have. And then if you only think about what has changed since this was published in the domains of information governance and I have suggested a bunch that you could add in there. To be fair, I put climate change and sustainability in there too because it's important. But these are just extra things that you could add in that we are aware are really, really important shifts in the role of the doctor, even since 2018 when the last version of Outcomes for Graduates came out. The curriculum, the undergraduate curriculum, is perpetually full to bursting and perpetually, if not already overflowing, then at risk of it. We have to get better at working out what we stop doing if we're going to keep adding things in. But I would argue that we need to know what it is that we want our doctors of the future to be so that we can work out what it is that we're prioritizing and what we're not. We cannot do it all. But in a world, so to steal Rory McCrimmon's line about where we are in the medical school right now, we need to be ruthlessly prioritizing. We need to be focusing on the things which must be done, the things which will provide the most gain for our students, for our staff, for our population. But who decides that? Who gets to make those calls? How do we ensure that the decisions we are making are equitable, are keeping to the values, to the things that we feel are the most important for our communities? And how do we make those decisions in a way that we can live with so that we can continue to feel like the job we're doing is the job we want to do? I don't know. I'm asking you because I think it's important that we share it. I'm really, really struck by this book by Naomi Alderman. I've been talking to everybody about it since I read it. It's got the amazing title, Don't Burn Anyone at the Stake Today. And she makes this argument that right now we are living through an information crisis. And she talks about how this is the third such crisis that humans have evolved through, at least the third, but she's picked on these. So we've had the development of writing, the development of printing, and now the development of the internet and the information sharing that comes with the internet and artificial intelligence and all that. It's all lumped together. And I can't find a way of paraphrasing her better than simply to cut and paste some of her quotes. But what she says is, if we perceive ourselves as part way through an enormous cognitive change, it's helpful. We can't actually imagine what those new futures are yet because they're going to come and they're going to change things so much that by the time we as a society have got through it, we're not going to be able to remember why we thought we needed to fight about these things. So she talks about how before we could get to the Enlightenment, we had to have the Reformation. And the Reformation involved an awful lot of fighting, a lot of literally burning people at the stake over things like transubstantiation, which now feels like a small element of doctrine, which perhaps most of us cannot really imagine wanting to die over. And yet we had to get through that before we could get the huge change in the scientific method, things like gravity, electricity, calculus, how human bodies work, all of those things were to come, but we had to get through those difficult phases first. And her argument, and therefore my argument, because I'm sharing it with you, is we're in that difficult phase right now. And what she says is that the internet allows us to find things we would not have been able to find out any other way. So she's got this great story about fixing a tumble dryer on an Airbnb using a YouTube video that means that she sticks her arm up into a completely invisible component, pulls off a thing, brings out a thing, gets this lump of fluff, and then the tumble dryer works again. She could never have managed that without the invention of the internet. We're in that stage. There are all sorts of things. People are accessing information. People are learning things about medicine that in the old days you had to come to study for years and years and years about. And I don't think we as a community know how that is going to change how we think about things in the future. So right now, we are I'm thinking particularly about AI because I think it's a good example of this, but it's only the most obvious bit because it's the conversation about it is so shrill. But we're teaching students about AI. We're teaching them how to use AI, and we're telling them when they're very, very bad because they used AI in a way we didn't want them to. I'm not sure that we are teaching educators more than that. But it feels like there's a gap there where we should be helping educators to not only understand the bits that we want the students to understand, but some more about how they can deal with the way that AI is changing the medical education, the education landscape. I've argued this for a long time, and I don't think it's changed, that what we need to focus on is teaching about adaptability, teaching about reflection, teaching about curiosity and self-care and value-driven learning rather than constantly focusing in on individual facts because the facts are becoming redundant through the information technologies that we have. And unless we can help ourselves and other people to pick up that adaptability, we're going to need our medical students of the future to be adaptable more than we're going to need them to be knowledgeable. And as institutions, we can change our focus by bringing those concepts, those values to the fore, whilst worrying slightly less, perhaps, about the exact learning outcomes that we are delivering, whether or not it's Krebs cycle. I'm trying not to pick on Krebs cycle today. One of the ways we do that is through widening participation and ensuring that we have as big a range of diversity within our learning cohorts as we possibly can. This is slightly old data. The last data point on it is from 2022, but you can see that we are not really winning the fight to bring diversity into medical schools. We are still seeing that if you apply from an independent school, you have a nearly 60% chance of getting into medical school, compared with to pick on selective state schools, that's now sitting well below 50%, and non-selective states have never managed to get as high as 50%. Why aren't we changing already? Why haven't the fact that so much of this is so obvious, I think, to many of us, why is that not having an impact? Well, a colleague of ours, Donna Quinn, has just finished her PhD, and she looked at specifically at what institutional responses are to widening participation. And she showed these three elements that are really impeding people's ability to make changes. So she talks about it, she uses the word hesitancy and talks about how we're frightened we'll offend people. By talking about changing, we offend people who are doing the old thing. It doesn't necessarily feel like any one person's responsibility. If anybody wants to advocate for change and there isn't a body of momentum behind you, you can feel very isolated. You can feel like you can be viewed as a troublemaker, or you can worry that you're going to be viewed as a troublemaker. And of course, we're not going to get everything right. There's a real risk that we are going to argue for changes and then something else shifts in the rapidly evolving world that we are in that mean that we didn't necessarily make the right call. And it takes a lot of guts to be able to be in a position to advocate for change, knowing that you might not be right. And then the other aspect in all of this, which Donna didn't cover so much within her PhD, but I think is really important to emphasize, is that we are individually and at system level close to complete burnout. There is so little bandwidth within the system for anything other than getting through the current crisis. And I think that makes it so difficult to get any kind of future perspective. It's taken me carving this hour out of Grand Rounds, me telling myself I will come and talk to you, to make me write down what I think. This is my last slide, and I've used this so many times, and I think it's actually the old Dundee Doctor icon over on the right-hand side, so forgive me, I really should update it. But I just wanted to highlight that we have been trying to bring some of these aspects, some of this future vision into the Dundee curriculum, the undergraduate curriculum, trying to help people to think about how they're going to need to be adaptable in the future, and to shift, and bringing that emphasis on reflection, on adaptability, on thinking about who you want to be, right from year one onwards. I tell a lie, it's my second last slide. I was going to finish with this lovely quote, again from Naomi Alderman. This new way of distributing information is going to create a new frame through which to view the world. And I don't know what it is, which I find exciting. So I'm going to finish by not sharing my screen any longer. There must be a button for that. And exhorting you to find it exciting too. We are in such a time of change, but that means that we have possibilities and potential to explore new things. Our job is to keep the wheel, my job as head of undergraduate is to keep the wheels on what we currently do and keep making doctors. But we've got to find ways that that is valuable, valued, and inherently rewarding for it to be worth doing. I will stop there. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Chris?
That was really excellent. That was a really, really interesting and stimulating um, topic to cover, and you did it really well. I was thinking as we go along, my worry is about, yeah, how does AI integrate into all of this? Because you've got that paradox where you need people to have the right level of knowledge to know when it's generating a hallucination. And if we don't have people learning the critical basics of medicine to have that framework to interrogate, we'll never know if we're getting
Yeah,
the right answer or not.
this is the problem, isn't it? Right there. So the we were just hearing this morning at the Scottish Medical School undergraduate Leeds meeting that the national working group looking at basic science education is about to report. And I'm willing to bet that they're going to say there isn't enough basic science education in the current medical curriculum, which I think is true, whilst at the same time the only thing that ever seems to get squeezed out now is the basic science. And it's that important question. How much of the basic science do we really need to know to be able to know when the system, the AI system or whatever else is inaccurate? And how much are we going to have to trust that it's getting accurate? Because the amount of time I use my knowledge of Krebs cycle in a given year is pretty small. But would I be where I am now? Would I know what I am now if I'd never learned it in the first place? There's no way to unpick that. And I think that's followed. Leslie's put a great question in the chat there about how much this is an individual medical school conversation and how much it needs to be national and international. I think that this is the problem. We are stuck in a loop where we can't really resolve it individually, but similarly, there's no will to grasp it nationally, and so or internationally, we're all kind of stuck. And I think that for as long, whilst the healthcare system is evolving really rapidly, if we don't drive some of that conversation locally and nationally and internationally, if we don't push how we want things to go, we'll end up being absolute victims of circumstance and just trying to cater to whatever the latest change is. And so I suppose my thought there, Leslie, particularly, was that we need to be trying to resolve some of this stuff locally so that we can really push the conversation more widely. And if anyone ever comes up with an answer to the how much do we need to know about Krebs cycle question, please let me know. Fantastic. Well, oh, Jonathan, oh, you're going to tell me.
No, I have absolutely no idea. I find as a geneticist, I do not need a detailed view
Need
of
a
the
lot of Krebs
cycle
cycle.
at all. And I had to learn it molecule by molecule for my exams. I mean, part of it is just a reflection on if you're looking, we teach stuff in a way because we examine in a way as well.
Absolutely.
Um, and the problem is that it's very hard, I suppose, to assess in-depth understanding and ability around use of AI. We can use things like portfolios and self-written stuff, hopefully not written on AI by the student. But in some ways, it needs a revolution on how we actually think about assessing it as well as teaching it.
Yeah, very much so. And yeah, I mean, I could do probably manage a whole other hour just on that bit, really. And you have to limit these things to some extent, but I agree with you, and I think all of that is going to come out in the wash. I just quite like to be part of the process of the washing rather than just being wrapped up in circumstances as they hit us.
Yes, and I wasn't going to mention in sci-fi the Logan's Run solution of vaporizing everybody at the age of 30.
Do you think that, yeah, and it's a long time since I've seen it. Do we get to be the extinguishers in that scenario, perhaps? I stop in there.
I,
Yeah,
I, I was going to mention the Doctor from Star Trek Voyager as well, the emergency medical hologram, which is where AI, I think,
yeah,
is at the moment. It hasn't yet adapted to be able to be all singing, all dancing. It can do very specific things within a specific role.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Fantastic.
I
Um,
mean, on the back of that one, I think we forget that in 60 years' time, our 80-year-olds will have had AI friends that they entrusted with everything when they were 20. So to
yeah,
have an AI doctor is a perfectly normal thing.
that's true. And with the level of system access it's likely to have, then you will have no secrets.
Yep.
And Connor's put a great question in the chat there about how can we teach ourselves to use AI first, and so that is a very important point, and I think it's been very obvious to us. In the Jordan has done some stuff around AI, and Stephen Bruce has done some stuff from the medical school side. We get a lot. I haven't done a medical education session anywhere for a good 18 months now without AI being one of the really dominant themes in the discussion afterwards, even if it doesn't come up in the main chat. I think it's definitely something we need to think about, a really big chunk of staff development. But how do we fit that in with everything else? That's the challenge. Grand. Right. It's 3 minutes past 2, so I guess that means that we it really would, Chris. It's 3 minutes past 2. I will let you all go. I'm very grateful to you all for your time and for indulging me in my hour of pontificating. Thank you very much. Grand Rounds returns as normal next week, I believe. Thank you very much. Bye now.